You're listening to the Gate of Trust podcast. Join hosts Matt Trush and Felix Friedberg's heart-to-heart conversations with artists, entrepreneurs, scholars, and laymen who, by strengthening their trust in God despite all odds, experience outright miracles. Profound yet practical, inspiring and heart-wrenching, moving true stories of triumph against adversity. Trusting in God can literally save lives. And now, Gate of Trust podcast hosts, Matt and Felix.
Hi, I'm Matt.
And I'm Felix.
And this is the Gate of Trust podcast.
Hey, Matt, I've got a good one for you. It's a little different today. It's topical.
Let's hear it, Felix.
All right. So 2 Jewish women were speaking about their sons, and unfortunately, their sons are having a tough time. They're incarcerated in a state prison. And the first mom says, "Oi, my son has it so hard. He's locked away. It's maximum security. He can never speak to anyone. He doesn't even see the light of day. Has no exercise. He has a horrible life." Ugh, the second woman says, "You know, my son, he's in minimum security. He exercises every day. He spends time in the prison library. He takes classes. He writes home each week." The first woman says, "Gosh, you must get so much nachas from your son."
Speaking of nachas in prison, today we've got Rabbi Dovid Goldstein on the Gate of Trust podcast. Rabbi Dovid Goldstein is a native of McAllen, Texas, who received his rabbinical ordination at Central Lubavitch Yeshiva in Kfar Chabad, Israel.
Rabbi Red, as he's known by his friends and admirers, is director of Chabad of West Houston, Katy, and CEO of the Friendship Circle of Houston, and Associate Director of Chabad Outreach of Houston.
Rabbi Goldstein also serves as the lead rabbi of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice since 2005. His positions include chaplain at the Richmond State School, Menninger Clinic, Federal Correctional Complex in Beaumont, and the Harris County Jail.
Rabbi Goldstein is married to Rebbetzin Elisa Goldstein. They have 5 children, Sima, Avrami, Chaya, Zalman, and Rosie.
Felix, since you mentioned the Goldstein kids, I want to start off with a question for the rabbi. Lately, or at least once a week, I've been seeing you and your son Avrami learning out of the White Book, the Gate of Trust Felagig Edition. When did you first pick up the Gate of Trust? And what was the impetus to start learning it with your son?
Hi, Matt. Thanks first of all, for having me on the show. And Felix, it's always a pleasure to see you guys. And now I get to actually hear you. So,
Would you haven't been listening to the podcast every week, Rabbi?
I listened, especially to Brian Gavin's. Anyways, so this is the deal. I'll give you an answer, but in general, as it's known, when you ask a rabbi a simple question, you're going to get a very long answer, but I'll tie it all together and answer your question. But I feel that you need to have a little bit of background to understand the answer, the total answer of this question. So here it goes. I came to Houston, Texas in 1998 with my dear wife, Elisa, and then our little daughter, Sima. About 1998 until the early 2000s, I had worked hand in hand with Rabbi Traxler as his programming director here in Houston for Chabad Outreach. The more time I spent in Houston, the more projects on a communal level I was very involved with, started to oversee. And that included the chaplaincy and then eventually even camp for the community. And at the same time, starting the Friendship Circle, and at the same time, starting Chabad in West Houston. So you had all of these enterprises going on at the same time. And many times when people read my bio, they ask, when do you sleep at night? And the truth is, I sleep at night limitedly, but I do sleep, thank God. But I think what they're really asking me is, how can you handle all these things? So the younger I was, I felt like I could handle everything, not a problem. And then sometime in my late 30s, like 37, 38, I started to have minor health hiccups, which was my sign from Hashem that, you gotta realize you are a human being, but at the same time, you have to also not take everything upon yourself that it's all about you, and you have to have me in mind. So it led me to a journey of what many people call discovering the status of mental health, how to limit stress, how to be more present in the moment. I had spoken to 2 religious professionals about it, and I came across a sefer back then. So this is over 10 years ago, like 11 years ago. That sefer, that book, was a book of letters from the Rebbe. And the Rebbe kept on mentioning the Shara Bitachon, Choves Halavavos, as a very important thing to be learning, and that's something that is very healthy and limits stress. And I felt that was a direct answer to me. So I started picking up on it. In those days, the white book didn't exist. And then there was like some shorter version that was in the internet that you could get. So slowly I started reading and thinking about the concepts that were there. And then Chayenu came out with their weekly print. And then I really started holding on to it, and I was cutting it out week by week. I put it all in a folder because I didn't know that they were going to put out a book one day to have it. And I felt that this was like really a very major thing, and something that the more you learn it, listen, I want to tell you something. Some people, they can read a book from A to Z and the knowledge is there in your head. But that's really not the way I was brought up in the Chabad system of thinking, in the yeshiva system. It's more about internalizing what you're reading. And even though the book, Choves Halavavos, or actually the Shara Bitachon part, is something that a lot of people talk about, it's really a workbook. It's really something that you have to read again and again and actually think about it, visualize it, put it in your life. And when I started doing that, it's a very slow process, but when I started doing that and thinking about it, whenever stressful things would come my way, juggling too many things, feeling like a perfect storm coming my way, I started thinking about concepts that I had read in the book, and it really changed my physical feeling about how I related to the stress and gave me more clarity. It gave me more clarity on how to deal with things. So last year, my son came to me that he was struggling with certain things in his stress and life and in his job and whatnot. And I asked him if he wants to learn something. And I told him about Shara Bitachon and that this is the Rebbe's, thing that the Rebbe had suggested many, many, many times. And we made we made a resolution that we're going to learn it once a week. And so most of the times on Thursday night, we get together and we have a kvius, we sit, we learn. And now we just don't read it. We read it and then we talk about it and try to bring it into our day-to-day lives and our day-to-day stresses to give us a more healthy outlook on how to deal with it. And that's my answer.
Thank you. That was a beautiful sermon. Felix, wake up.
No, I'm here. I'm next. All right, Rabbi. So how is it that a Chabad house rabbi gets involved and becomes the lead rabbi of the Department of Criminal Justice? How do you become the chaplain of the prisons?
So, interesting question. When I had a few job options on the table, shlichus options, and one of them was here in Houston, Texas. And when I initially came down for my interview, it wasn't going to be about prisons. It was to be a chaplain in a certain place here in Houston for a certain Jewish organization. And that didn't work out. But then Rabbi Traxler told me that he has something and it involves going to prison. And honestly, I had never gone to prison in my life. Maybe as a Cub Scout as a field trip as a kid in McAllen, Texas. They took us to see the jail cell in the police station. But in my wildest dreams, I never thought I would ever go to prison. So that first month I was here, I got here in August of 1998. Rabbi Traxler took me with him for the day to Beaumont. And, I'm the type of person that if you're going to learn something new, you got to jump into the deep end first. I guess Rabbi Traxler felt the same way because the very first institution that I went to prison in my life was the USP in Beaumont. What is USP? The USP means the United States Penitentiary. There are 4 different levels of security, and USP is the highest level of security of all of them. And that was the first prison I walked into. It was very intimidating. I mean, if those who have never gone to a prison before, you pull up and you've seen in your lives in the airports, the towers, that they look at the airplanes where, that they see what's going on. So the prison has many, many of these towers around the perimeter fence of the prison. And you realize this place is not it's not a Club Med. It's not a 5-star hotel. And you walk in and everything is controlled movement. You can't get from point A to point B without there being an automatic gate opening and closing between you. So I walk into this prison with Rabbi Traxler, and we go into this office, and there are 2 Jewish inmates that are there. And obviously, the very first thing they tell you in your crash course of being a prison rabbi is you're really not supposed to ask people, what are you there for? So because you're not asking them what you're there for, but you're looking at these colorful individuals, colorful personalities, and you start to think to yourself, what good deeds did a person do to end up in such a beautiful Club Med, if you will? But that stays in your mind. It doesn't come out of your mouth. And I'll never forget it. Rabbi Traxler sat down and he introduces me to the 2 inmates and then says, and he's going to be presenting today's lesson. So I really didn't know that was going to come my way. But because every rabbi always has to have at least something in their head to share, because the moment might come that you're going to be asked to say something. So I remember it was before Rosh Hashanah, and we started speaking about the concept of teshuvah, told over a story. And then Rabbi Traxler on the way out told me, David, you did really well. We have another few prisons to visit here in the federal system here in Beaumont. I'm going to send you by yourself now. You're going to go to this one and I'll go to the other one. And this way we can finish our day a little quicker. So I was like totally, sorry to use the term from the 80s, freaked out, because it's a lot to process, So you've never gone to prison before. But he did me a favor. He sent me to the low level called the camp. People call that's the 5-star prison. It's no 5-star. Yes, there's air conditioning, but there's no fences. So the movement is more open. And there were like about 5 Jewish people there. And I also fabrang with them, spoke with them, gave them some insight into the upcoming high holidays. And at the end, Rabbi Traxler said, you did a wonderful job, got good feedback. You're going to go now by yourself every month. And so that became my monthly thing to go to the federal prison. So this was in August of 98. In April of 99, I was introduced to a rabbi who was here in Houston. His name was Ted Sanders, Oliver Shalom. And he was the head rabbi of the Texas prison system. And he was already getting advanced in years. And the state had just started a program in where they took the Jewish prisoners and they put them in less prisons around the state and divided it up, and rabbis will go to these limited number of prisons around the state. So Rabbi Sanders recruited me to go to the Huntsville area to start seeing the Jewish inmates in the Huntsville area, and he's going to see the Jewish inmates in the Texas area. So in April of 99 began my monthly trek up to Huntsville to start my prison work with the state prison level. So this is my intro of how I got into it.
Rabbi, we also know you have some amazing stories, bar mitzvah on death row and all others. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like and how did Bitachon help you through it?
So I'm going to save the death row story, I guess, for last and kind of give more of a historical structured thing of how we got to where we are. Where is it today? What did the Texas prison system look like then? We're going to focus just on that. And where is it now? So you're talking from 2000 or 1999 till 2023. So back then, there were roughly about 80 Jewish inmates around the state of Texas. And they were split up into a couple of units. There was a lay leader, a person who would go to the Dallas area to one of the prisons there. Rabbi Maris would go from Chabad would go in the San Antonio area. I would go in the Huntsville area, and Rabbi Sanders would go in the Houston area. And these visits were monthly visits. What we were able to do for the inmates was every Pesach, we would send them care packages. From Aleph Institute would coordinate it. And they would get their matzahs, grape juice, gefilte fish, horseradish in a packet, and charoset in a packet with a Haggadah, and macaroons, of course. By the way, you should know that if you ever want to become rich in prison, there's a massive traffic and trade business for macaroons. What you can get for a macaroon, you could turn the whole world over. That's why everybody wants to become Jewish around Pesach time. So anyhow, but that's a side issue. So anyhow, when I walked into the prison system, this is what I saw. And I was very new at my job, I made sure to listen to some talks of Shalom Ber Lipsker in Aleph in Miami. And I talked to Rabbi Traxler, and at the Kinnis HaShluchim spoke with other shluchim who go to prisons, because I was trying to get my head wrapped around, like, what is it? What am I needed for? What am I supposed to be doing here? Am I just going to just give a shir and just throw out good words, or is there like a higher kavana that's meant for this? So I started analyzing, thinking, doing, and life went on, monthly visits. There were a few times where I really had to dig deep into the Bitachon. Actually, the reason is back then the state was not as progressive in the prison system as it is today. So if a Jewish inmate, for example, this is one of my first Rosh Hashanahs, this is probably like the second or third here in Houston. I got a phone call from the prison right before Rosh Hashanah that they're not allowing the inmates to get together for Rosh Hashanah. And I'm like, that's so disgusting, because you allow the inmates to get together for all the other holidays, and there's very few Jewish inmates. And whatever we're asking for is nothing. I wasn't like, I'm going to go pick them up in a bus and bring them to my synagogue in Houston. It was like, they're just going to get together for 1 hour in the chapel. One of them is going to blow the shofar for all of them. And maybe they'll have some grape juice and matzah and make Yiddish. That's the whole big deal. But they didn't want to allow it. So it's times like this when you dig deep into yourself and you're like, why did Hashem put me in this position? Where am I supposed to go with it? What am I supposed to do? So first comes the concept of Hashgacha Pratis. You realize that obviously I have something in me that God chose me to be here at this specific moment, at this specific time, and I got to make it happen. So I learned early on in life that obviously you definitely put your trust in Hashem, and at the same time with Hashgacha Pratis and whatnot, Hashem makes your life in such a way that there's also people that are Hashem's shluchim at the right place in the right time to enable you to be able to fulfill the thing that Hashem has in mind for you. So this was, I guess, my first collision course with the state prison. It was way back then. So what did I do? I found out, and I had known of a Jewish representative from the Texas House of Representatives. His name was Scott Hochberg. And I called him up and I said, can you imagine that they're not allowing the inmates at the Walls unit in Huntsville to get together? And he was so upset. So what I didn't know 100% was that this representative, had a personal friendship with the executive director of the whole prison system. So he called him up on the phone and he said, this is going on. Anyways, I ended up getting a phone call right before Yontif from the head chaplain that, Rabbi Goldstein, were you having a problem in the Walls unit? And I said, yes, I was. They weren't allowing the Jewish inmates. Oh, well, next time you have a problem, you could call us directly. I said, I don't even know who you are, because I was working under basically this Rabbi Sanders. So like the chain of command, I don't even know you exist as the head chaplain. You're calling me and telling me you're the head chaplain. He says, oh, because, we got a call from the executive director, and the Jewish inmates, for sure they could get together for Rosh Hashanah. And it happened. And I was all excited that Baruch Hashem, the kavanah was fulfilled. The inmates were able to get together and blow shofar. And I remember telling Rabbi Lazarus about it, and he gave me a whole speech. And he even spoke about it, that Rosh Hashanah, about Gaon Yaakov, Jewish pride. Don't back down. You're a shliach of the Rebbe. Hashem put you here for a certain reason. Have Bitachon, have Emunah and Bitachon. Put it up in Hashem's hands. You just got to execute. You got to do and let Hashem fulfill it. And this was the very first thing. I have many, many, many more stories of these kinds of things. I think I wanted to share with you before we get to the later stories. I call it the Pesach Sheni Seder. So you're going to wonder, what's a Pesach Sheni Seder? So Pesach Sheni Seder happened like this. A couple of years, I think it was maybe 2 years after this Rosh Hashanah fiasco, I wanted to enhance the lives of the inmates. Their Pesach wasn't like 5-star cuisine, All it was, as I say, was matzah, gefilte fish, macaroons, and grape juice, and little grain packets. And that was it. So I saw that year, Olive Institute started selling shelf-stable meals and shelf-stable salmon. You imagine that. So I'm like, They should enjoy. It's Yontif. Why not? Our shlichus is called rehabilitation through Yiddishkeit, So gotta help them out. And it's not just like a food fest, but, in Judaism, is it all about the food? No, it's not all about the food, but food definitely helps. It's definitely a big part of it. So anyhow, what was the story? So the story is that from that same chaplain that I had the problem with that Rosh Hashanah, I got permission from him to make these individual orders for the inmates. And I showed him the order list from Aleph Institute. And he said, sure, every inmate, they could order what they need. Because I told them the ultimate thing is here, Passover is an 8-day holiday. Whatever has been sent until now is really something that they could eat at the Seder. But most of the inmates are not going to keep Passover. So I want to help enable them to keep their 8 days of Passover, whoever would like to do it. So he said he was fine with it. So I remember I passed out the papers. The inmates all filled out their papers. I placed the order. Okay. Like 3 weeks go by. All of a sudden I get a phone call from this chaplain and he is flaming. He's just like upset, burning up. And he starts screaming at me and I was laughing. I thought maybe he dialed the wrong number and he was going at it. And he kept on saying, you did this. And I remember laughing. I actually was visiting a prison in Beaumont when he called me. And I remember being in the parking lot and getting yelled at. And I'm just laughing. He's saying, I did it. He didn't even say what I did, but it sounds pretty interesting so far. So I'm like, okay, so what is it that I did? I'm sorry that I did something. What did I do? So he said, all of a sudden, there were like these 5 big boxes of Passover food that showed up in the prison. And where did we get authorization to do this? And I'm listening. I don't respond because, you learn, you don't try to calm that guy down when he's so angry like that. Got to let him get it out of his system a little bit. So after he aired out a little bit, I said, chaplain, I thought like a month ago when I was there, I showed you the papers. We had photocopies and you told me that the inmates could order their food. And he said, yeah, but I didn't know it was going to be so much. And now it's all here and the security is down my back. And so he's going on and screaming. Then I realized that he probably dropped the ball and didn't realize what was coming. And so he had needed to secure with the security that all this food is coming in. And because he didn't do it, security was coming down on him. And now he's blaming me for it because I'm the Jewish fall guy, right? So anyways, it's Erev Pesach at this point. And I'm going out of town. I used to go to Toronto for Pesach in those days to my in-laws. And I remember my wife reminded me about it, how we were in a stopover in Detroit airport and I'm walking up and down the terminal screaming on the phone because there was a lot of fighting going on between me, the head chaplain, this chaplain, and the Mr. Hochberg, the state representative, as to are they going to allow the inmates to have this Pesach food that came in? So my understanding was that we resolved it. So I went on with Pesach in Toronto. It's all good. Moitzoi Pesach. After Passover is over, I get an email from a mother of one of the inmates. And I remember reading it in Toronto and I was so heartbroken. She writes in the email, what happened was that the inmates got together for Pesach. They put all the food out and they were having a nice Seder. And then all of a sudden, at the end of the Seder, the guards came in and they confiscated all the food and they didn't allow the inmates to have their food the rest of Passover. And I was livid because a waste of money. The inmates didn't, the money's last. Bottom line is the inmates didn't have Pesach. They weren't able to keep Pesach. They took everything away from them. And there was no reason behind it because to my understanding, I thought we'd cleared everything up, but it didn't sit well with me. So right away, I wrote an email to Mr. Hochberg, the representative. And in the morning, I had a very nice conversation with him, detailing everything from A to Z, that from my perspective, what went on. Same kind of result happened. He made his phone calls. And then a couple of days later, I remember it was like around Rosh Chodesh Iyar. I was already back in Houston and I get a phone call from the leadership of the Texas prison system. And the chaplain is on the phone and he gives me this whole spiel. The head chaplain, he was Catholic. And he said, I don't know how Jewish law works, but by us, if for whatever reason we couldn't do the religious service on that day, we could postpone the religious service to another day. So in my mind, I'm laughing. It's like the concept of nidche, like a fast day. You push it off, right? So he asked me, can we push off Passover? So I'm laughing. And I said, you know what? We can't push off Passover. The Torah tells us Passover is when it is. That's the date. It's the anniversary of leaving Egypt. And that's when it happened. What am I going to do? Celebrate Passover and Hanukkah or something? What do you want from me? But then all of a sudden I got this thought in my mind. And I said, you know what? I want to teach you something from the Bible. So I went and I read in the little section in Bamidbar about Pesach Sheni. And I said, it's not going to make up for Passover, but you should just know that there was the second chance offering, and in Judaism, we learn it's never too late. So he said, well, can we make a second Passover Seder? So I said, we won't really be a Seder, but we can have like a gathering. So he said, okay. And so he told me, go to the prison on that day. So I go up to Huntsville on that day, and I remember all the Pesach food was put on the table. It looked like a buffet, and all the inmates were brought in. And we had our Pesach Sheni Farbrengen / Pesach Sheni Seder. And the inmates were laughing because they saw the leadership showed up and they were screaming at the leadership of that particular prison that how dare you do such a thing to the Jewish inmates. And so why am I telling you this story? Because immediately after this story happened, the chaplain of that prison who I had butted heads with twice turned to me and he said, I wanted you to know something, Rabbi Goldstein. The iron is hot. So I'm like, I'm a Texan, but I'm from McAllen. We don't speak redneck. Tell me what that means. The iron is hot. Like, what are you trying to tell me? So he said, the iron is hot means that if you have an agenda, right now is your time to go for it because you have a lot of power on your side right now based on what has happened here. So I'm like, oh, okay. And I took it to heart. At that point, I thought about starting to rewrite the policies and the procedures of the Texas prison system for the way it relates to Jewish inmates, because they were so outdated. It barely gave Jewish people normal rights. And I realized that every time I ever had an issue with a chaplain, they were always like, well, it doesn't say so in policy. So now I had a chance. Well, if I have a chance, let me rewrite the policy. And then they can never say, doesn't say so in the policy, because the policy will clearly say it. And that began before Rabbi Sanders passed away for 1 year. That happened in 2004, this whole story. And then I started writing with Rabbi Sanders. And then I had a former inmate join us because I wanted to make it foolproof. So I had the Jewish offender read this policy, because offenders become lawyers, by the way, all of them in jailhouse lawyers. So I'm like, what can you make of this? And he would sit and he would tell us, well, I could probably write a lawsuit on that. I could probably write a lawsuit on this. So then we would rewrite it, change it up. And my wife always laughs when we talk about it, because she says it looked like the dream team. You have Rabbi Goldstein, a Chabad rabbi. You have Rabbi Sanders, who was like a freelance rabbi of sorts. You have this ex-inmate. And then we had this other guy who was like a lay leader and a volunteer. And we're all sitting there putting our heads together for the benefit of the Jewish inmates and really creating the Jewish future for the Jewish inmates. So I'm going to pause now because I know that it's been somewhat long-winded, and see if you have any questions, because what I'm trying to do is that this is kind of leads us. I've established the history of the footing of why we got to where we got. And then I want to just touch on two more stories. One story is, I'm not going to mention him by name, but I'm just going to talk about an Orthodox inmate and what really pushed me to make the policy what it is today, the birth of what we got from it. And then I'll end off with the story of the bar mitzvah on death row.
Rabbi, the iron is hot. You got to keep going.
The iron is hot. But I have a question. I don't want to take you off track, because the iron is hot and you're on a roll. But this is not on our list of questions, but I was thinking, obviously, when unfortunately anyone or a Jewish person ends up in jail, I'm wondering from your work that their feelings towards Hashem could be compromised. They may feel like, what has God done to me? Or they might react differently. So I'm wondering, Rabbi, in your work with prisoners, did you come across people who that's how they began? And as you talked with them, and through your kindness and through their growth in Yiddishkeit, they began to realize, the goodness of Hashem and the maybe the choices they made.
So I want to share with you. A little story. In those early 2000s, once in my visits to Huntsville, I found out about a Jewish inmate who was at a transfer facility. I went in to see him, and this was a guy that he had been involved in some pretty big financial scam. Didn't look extremely remorseful, but his family reached out. He's just starting his sentence now, and he has some years to go, and see what you could do for him. And I remember I went in and I started talking to him, and it was also right before the Yom Noroyim. It's before Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. And I actually brought him machzorim for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And we started to farbring about a certain point. What was the main point? The point is that a Jew cannot separate himself from Hashem. Even if you sin, even though you may sin, Yisrael, you're still a Jewish person, Hashem still loves you. And a Jew is not wired to sin. It's the Ruach Shtus that comes, the spirit of folly, and it hijacks you, and it's more of an external thing. And what we need to work with is to connect with the internal, with the inside part. I left him the books, and I didn't know if I made an impact or I didn't make an impact. A couple of weeks later, I get a letter from him, a beautiful handwritten letter, in which he thanks me very much for coming to visit him. He was shocked that a rabbi would take his time to come and visit him. Obviously, he tells me like he grew up in the Jewish community. He didn't have much a relationship with rabbi or with God. It wasn't in his thinking at all. And the message that I shared with him was the right place at the right time. And it really resonated with him. So much so, he told me that he took the machzor for Yom Kippur and he read it from cover to cover. And it was the first time in his life that he ever read really the machzor, coming from one of these mega Jewish congregations in Houston. So why am I telling you this story? Because what I've seen most of the time is not that people feel that God forsake them. Most of the time, that people aren't thinking about God. Most of the time, they're living very unspiritual lives and are most of the time the criminal element. They're outside of the community. Now, I could talk psychology with you about it and tell you that many of them had a lot of behavior problems growing up. So they were already on the fringe of the community. And because they were thrown out of Hebrew schools, they were like never really embraced, many of them within the community. So they didn't have a relationship with Hashem. This is one of the main things that I talk to them about, because we're talking about rehabilitation through Yiddishkeit, is introducing spirituality, introducing Hashem into their thinking and becoming spiritual from it. I hope that answers your question.
Very, very good answer. Thank you, Rabbi.
Beautiful, Rabbi. Rehabilitation through Yiddishkeit.
So just to continue the prison stories, and I think this is where you see a lot of bit of the Emunah and Bitachon part come into it. Because to establish, even though I had the responsibility from the state to put together this new and enhanced Jewish directives, the policy for the state, I've come to learn a few things. Everything that's good never comes easy. And if it comes easy, then you got to check out to see you're doing the right thing. That's my life story. Let's just focus on the prison part of it. So I start writing this policy, and it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And in the midst of everything, Rabbi Sanders passes away. And then the state appoints me as the head rabbi. And we keep on going. Back and forth means that we would propose the policy with the changes, and they'd kick it back to us. And it just seemed like a process. It was just going on forever and ever and ever, and we weren't going anywhere with it. It was getting very frustrating. Around this time, there was a Jewish inmate who was an Orthodox inmate who came from out of the country, from Canada, and he was arrested for something, and he came up with he had an 8-year prison sentence. And it was heartbreaking on many levels, because when he came into the system, it was through Dallas, through the county jail there. And unfortunately, nobody had a relationship with anybody. I'm not talking about just from our Chabad rabbis that do prison chaplaincy, but nobody from A to Z, from any of the rabbinical, whatever circles in Dallas, had any form of relationship that would be helpful to this inmate who was in the county jail. And guess what? It was Pesach. So unfortunately, this inmate did not get matzahs the whole Pesach. And he was a from Jew. I just want to take a sidestep here for our listening audience. I don't want anyone to chas v'shalom think that I think that everybody is innocent. And that therefore I want to provide everybody with services because I believe that they're innocent. I also don't want anyone to think that I think that everybody is guilty. I was taught, there was a very special, beautiful Orthodox rabbi here in Houston. His name is Rabbi Radinsky, Olav Shalom. And he once taught me, because I had a very nice relationship with him, told me, Rabbi Goldstein, the best way of a rabbi in life, you have to have a balance. He called it chabdeu v'chajdeu. It's a statement, which means first you have to honor the person, and then you suspect the person, and not the other way around. So this has been always my guiding light of the rehabilitation work that I do. So I know that I'm facing people that are potential murderers, and they're not there because they're the biggest tzaddikim. I do know that. But at the same time, I was taught by the Rebbe to have unconditional Avos Yisrael for every single Jewish person, and to have Rachmanis on their neshama that is trapped within their body that really just wants to express itself. But unfortunately, there's a massive disconnect between the external and the internal. This is my guiding light of how I deal with them, how I look at them. So I might sound like I think everybody's innocent and it's a beautiful world and kumbaya. I know what I'm dealing with. I just don't want to focus on it. What I want to focus on is how can I help this person and bring them to the next level and bring them in the right path so that they can have a better walk with Hashem, as we call it, right? So this is what it's all about. So anyhow, this Orthodox inmate doesn't get his matzahs, and it really irritated me. And I had been in touch with his family. Baruch Hashem, then he ends up getting into TDC, into the state level. The first time I met him, it was right before Rosh Hashanah. I remember in those days I used to do the chauffeur factory, and I had all of my stuff in my car. As I pulled up to the prison, I thought to myself, oy vey, I didn't bring this inmate a chauffeur. He should have a chauffeur for a show. I have his machzor, but I don't have a chauffeur. So I remember opening up the trunk of my little Volvo station wagon, and in the parking lot of the prison, I took my power tools and I cut the horn, the goat horn, and drilled it and made it right there in the Huntsville parking lot. And I brought it into the prison with me for this inmate. The inmate was so grateful. And we began our relationship. It lasted close to 7 years. Unfortunately, they did transfer him on Rosh Hashanah, right? Like, they don't get their timing right, the prison system. The Goyish cup doesn't understand the Jewish way. But anyways, we transferred it. So they transferred him. Anyways, eventually he ends up in San Antonio for a while with Rabbi Maris. And then he ended up in Sugar Lab with me, what was called the Central Unit. My biggest struggle with him was the state at that point. You couldn't be Orthodox. You couldn't be frum in the state, in the system, because the policy in those days read that regarding Sabbath observance, it's up to the job to decide if they want to let you off, and that they're encouraged to let you off, but it's not an obligation to. So that's Shabbos. Tefillin, you can't have in your possession. Kosher food, what kosher food? There were no kosher food in the state then. This is what he had to deal with. And I remember, God forbid I won't get in trouble in it, but I remember one time I smuggled 2 times kosher food for him into the prison just because I felt bad he didn't have meat to eat. One time it was these kosher, beef jerky sticks, like the little pepperoni sticks, the kosher ones. I had it in my pocket and I brought it in. I gave it to him so he should have some kosher meat to eat. And another time was right before Simchas Torah, I brought in kreplach in my pocket for him. He should have epis. He should have something, right? We were able to secure that he was able to put on tefillin a couple of times a week. But this is what it looked like. You want to be frum? You were at the whim of the rabbi smuggling little handheld kosher meat for you, right? Other people smuggle chveisnishvas into the prison, but we're smuggling kosher salami, right? Rabbi gets busted. Anyways, let's imagine the front page now. But
kreplach in pocket and pepperoni in sock.
It's sock, and then here we go, right? But it was wonderful. We were able to enable him to do as best he could, and he tried really hard to keep kosher to the best of his possibilities. The commissary, which is like the store inside, had a number of things, but like this guy lived on peanut butter, tortillas, freeze-dried beans and rice, and tuna, and cereal and milk from the prison, and cold canned vegetables that they would put him in a bowl. And he really tried, and it really irked me. Anyhow, at one point, every year around Sukkah's time, he would ask me if we could get a sukkah in the system. There was no sukkah in the system. And every year I tried and it never went anywhere. One year I said, that's it. We're going to do it. We're going to do it. This was right around the time where the policy was almost totally approved, which is a whole story in of itself. Maybe I'll do that now and I'll come back to it. So remind me where we are in this story. I'm going to pause and then go on a sidebar here. So I remember I went with my wife to New York for Chav Bei Shvat. Yeah, it's not a very common time for the shluchim to go because that's when the wives go. That year I wanted to go because I wanted to present the Rebbe with the policy. The policy had been basically finalized and I had really worked very, very, very hard on it. And I wanted to deliver it in person to the Ohel. And I remember I went to the Ohel, I believe it was a Thursday or maybe it was a Friday. And then after I went to the Ohel, I emailed the policy to Mr. Hochberg. And then on Motzei Shabbos, I checked my email and Mr. Hochberg, who was that state representative who had been helpful all those years to me, wrote me back that this is so timely. I just got this because on Friday, they placed me in the committee of oversight for policies and procedure for the whole Texas prison system.
Wow.
And that happened at the time, basically when I was at the OHEL presenting this new policy. That's all I needed to know. I knew at this point we got the bracha. This is what we need. And boom, the policy was the policy that was approved. Baruch Hashem. So now going back to this story, this is from Shvat. So all of a sudden it's Tammuz time. This is the same year. I was being summoned up to Huntsville basically every month or so for updates because at the same time while all this was going on, there was a lawsuit that an inmate had made that he didn't have kosher food and he was suing the state. So I was being a consulting rabbi to the state, trying to help him and trying to craft a resolution for, a settlement that would make sense for the state and for the inmate. And so all this came together in one thing. One of the meetings was Tammuz time. I remember it was Shavas Tammuz, and I had a volunteer drive me up. I didn't want to drive up and down to Huntsville on the fast day. And I met with the top wigs of the prison system. And at the end of the meeting, I started talking about the sukkah. And I remember that we ended off a meeting. Okay, we'll look into it. Let's reconvene about this. Just Shavas Tammuz. Then I remember it was Chofav. I remember exactly where I was that day. And I called the head chaplain because a month had gone by and I hadn't heard anything. And Sukkot is going to come before you know it. And so the head chaplain told me, look, we met about it and we decided we're not doing it. And I got very upset. I got very upset because at that point I had already an established position with the state of what they called lead consulting rabbi. And basically my job is when there's something Jewish to be talked about, you trust me as your authority. We're going to talk about it and we're going to create the policy to either enable it or to not do it. I was very upset that the head chaplain is telling me that he met with the other leaders and that they decided they're not going to allow the sukkah, especially because they never saw a sukkah in their life. After he told me the bad news, it was a big letdown. I wasn't going to take it. So what did I do? I called the number 3 in charge of the prison system. I had her cell phone number and I told her, this chaplain just told me this unfortunate news. I just wonder if we can revisit this. It just doesn't sit well with me. You know what she told me? She was shocked. She said, we met? I don't recall having a meeting. So I'm like, aha, there was no meeting. So there's no decision then. She says, no, Rabbi, there's no decision about the sukkah. So I said, so what can we do about it? So she said, well, I could come down with the number 2 of the prison system. She's the number 3 and the number 2. And we'll come down to Houston, to the closest prison unit, which was the central unit where this Orthodox inmate that was asking for the sukkah was. And we'll talk about it. We'll set it up. So I was like, that's great. So we made up the date. The date was Yud Tes Elul. How do I know? Because my sister got engaged in New York on Chai Elul that year. And I flew to New York for her L'chaim. And I came home with a pop-up sukkah from the sukkah center. And I brought it home with me. And so the next day I went to prison. I had asked her, do me one favor and make sure that this chaplain doesn't show up to the meeting because I don't want him there. So she's like, okay, Rabbi. But unfortunately, he showed up. Ends up being not so unfortunate. But anyhow, He shows up and I'm like, this guy's a liar and he's here or whatever. Okay. So we did a tour of the whole prison system because at this point we were talking about the resolution of this lawsuit, perhaps creating a kosher kitchen here, how it would work. And I'm having this whole meeting. But before the meeting started, I got together with that Orthodox inmate and we built the pop-up sukkah. The second director wanted it built inside because he didn't want all the inmates to look at it and see. He wanted to study it from a security perspective to see it's okay. And so he and I built the sukkah indoors and we finish our whole long tour of the whole prison system, and it ends off in the chapel with the sukkah indoors standing there. So who's there? The number 2, the number 3, and the head chaplain and myself. And we're all there, and the local warden as well. But from the leadership, this is what's going on. We're all standing together. So I turned to the number 2, and I said, can we discuss the sukkah? He said, oh, yeah, the booth. Yeah, so this booth. So he sits and he's like looking at it for just a couple of seconds. He asked me a few questions. He said, do these walls have to be the walls or could we have see-through walls? I said, no, we could use see-through walls. We could use, I could get like plastic shower curtains and like tape them down and whatever. They're like, okay, fine. You could have it. You could have this booth. And I remember I smiled so big and then I had to. Then I turned to the head chaplain who had told me that they had said no, and I gave him a big smile. And that was the end of that meeting. So as I'm walking out, the Orthodox inmate was in the yard walking around and he said, oh, how did the meeting go? And I said, Baruch Hashem. I said, we were approved. And he was like so excited. Then I went on my way and he went on his way. And a couple of days later, I get an emergency call from his mother, this inmate's mother. And she told me that this inmate collapsed on the yard and that they rushed him to the hospital and that they diagnosed him with a very rare leukemia known as acute leukemia. And he was now in the ICU in Galveston. And it was really shocking to me. Also, I had given him a slichus. He asked me for a slichus. I gave him a brand new slichus and he used it that night on Motzei Shabbos. And then on Sunday is when he collapsed. I remember I went down to visit with him and daven with him, but he was in a coma. It was a very sad situation. Then his parents came down from Canada and we were trying really hard to get him transferred to MD Anderson because acute leukemia, even though it's very fast, but if you treat it fast, you could reverse it. They couldn't reverse it where he was. He would have to go to MD Anderson. And I remember it was like Erev Yontif and I worked mamish until the closing moments. And at that year, I had my own services for high holidays going on at the JCC in West Houston. I remember setting everything up and being on the phone at the same time. All these things going all crazy. And then I remember on Motzei Yontif, I called the family to find out how Yontif was. I'll never forget. They said, so how was Yontif? Well, basically, our son was nifter on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And I was so devastated because I felt that everything I did, he was like a guiding force for me to make sure that if Chas v'Shalom Mafrum Yid ever needs to go into jail, that they should be able to be frum and do all the Torah mitzvahs without having those limitations that were going on in the prison system till then. And it was a really sad thing for me. I went with a family. We buried him in Canada the day after Tzom Gedalia. And the end all was, I remember when I was burying him, I made a pledge to him that I'm going to continue the work in his memory and make sure that no Jew is left behind and that we'll put into place the standards that he would have been proud of. And we buried him. And this was Tzom Gedalia.
In his schus that you got a sukkah into
that's right.
the prison system.
And then that sukkahs we made a farbrengen.
Many other things. Yeah.
And then that sukkahs we made a farbrengen in that jail with it. And we felt his presence. It was so amazing, the spiritual feeling. And then mamish within 3/4 of a year later was when we opened up the kosher food program at the Stringfellow unit. And it just jumped forward. Look what we have today. We have the Stringfellow program is a unit. It has like 15 inmates right now in it. There's a glatt kosher kitchen. People have become frum in the program. People have learned about tefillin and put on tefillin every day. People have come out of that prison program and have some have reintegrated into the community. It's been a tremendous program.
Amazing, Rabbi. Incredible. Maybe you leave us with one last story. I know you wanted to tell us a story about death row.
My question to you is, because the story, many people have heard it. Do you want me to go into all the details or timeline?
There's millions of people who haven't heard it, Rabbi. So
Millions. Okay, so the millions
And
are
I
going to
know
hear
a
it now.
billion in China, so don't worry about it. We got subtitles in Chinese.
Very good. People ask me, what was like one of your best prison stories? So outside of the ones you've heard today, circumstantial things, I think one of the most impactful stories in my prison career so far, in my outreach work, is about an inmate who was on death row. Basically, there was an inmate from Dallas, Texas, who was on death row, and I didn't know that he was on death row because he never registered that he was Jewish. There used to be a Chabadnik, Ari Hutchinson, lived in Houston here, and he was in law school then, and he was working for an organization that was dealing with people on death row, and he was the one who told me about him. So I investigated, and I said, oh, wow, this was at the beginning of the summer. He was set to be executed in August. So I'm like, wow, not only there's a Jew, he's a Jew with a date. That's not cool. What are we going to do? So obviously, my job is not to deal with that aspect of it. I'm here to be the religious leader and the spiritual guide to people that are in these kinds of situations. So I wanted to facilitate a visit with him and to see him. So I met his mother on the phone. And his mother told me that, yeah, he's a disturbed person. I could look him up online, which I did. And he was quite a colorful character, to say the least. She had told me that he wanted to be cremated, which didn't sit well with me, because in Jewish law, you're not allowed to be cremated. And secondly, she also told me that he was a behavior problem and he never had a bar mitzvah. So I had this idea. I want to go visit him. And I want to have a bar mitzvah for him before he gets executed. So I made the date and I went over to the prison myself. Rabbi Mendy Traxler came with me, and we drove up to the Polanski unit in Lake Livingston, Texas. I had to negotiate with a prison to allow me to have what they call a full contact visit with him, because people that are on death row, generally, you meet them behind the glass. And I had to, I really wanted to, put on tefillin with him, not just give it to the guard, hand it to him, and I tell him through the glass, this way, how to do it, God blessed me with an idea. I absolutely have no idea about other religions, but I did know that the Catholics have some sort of a ritual before they die, like called the rosary or something like that. And all I knew about it is that that the Catholic priests were allowed to have full contact visits with the Catholic inmates to do this rosary deal with them. So I told the leadership, Judaism has a similar thing. It's called saying vidui and putting on tefillin. So can I please have some time to do it? So they approved it. They gave me half an hour to be in full contact with him. And the day came, we went up to the prison, as I said. And I walk in and we're waiting for him to show up. And he comes in, this inmate, and he's chained all over. He's chained with his hands, chained in his feet, and chained around his stomach. And they sit him down. And I already knew he was very colorful and he had a terrible temper. So I didn't want to push his buttons. And he starts off by thanking us for making the trip to come and visit him. And by the way, just a timeline, so his execution date was less than a week away at this point. We were just kibitzing. And he laid out a rule, which was very disturbing to me, which was, listen, Rabbi, I am happy that you came, but I don't want to hear anything about Judaism. In fact, if you're going to talk religion with me, we're going to end the visit right now. And that was very difficult for me, a rabbi, to hear, because in my mind, I had two things I really wanted to accomplish with him. Number one, to put on tefillin with him. And number two, to convince them not to get cremated. And I had 30 minutes to do it. And now he's starting the 30 minutes with a big challenge that, oh, by the way, I don't want to talk about religion. So it was really, really difficult. And I remember I was playing like mental chess with him, meaning like talking about other things that nothing to do with religion. And then always coming back to a little bit of religion and then going away from religion and then coming back in and going zigzagging in and out, because I really was trying to figure how to penetrate into his mind that we should be doing this. He caught on. He was a very smart man. He was crazy, but he was smart. And he screams at one point, I told you I don't want to speak about religion. And I was like, oh boy. Anyhow, we started to discuss his crimes. He brought it up. He told me some really interesting things. And then I saw how he's very, very interesting because in his mind, by the way, just so you know, when he was executed, his last statement that he made, he says, and he said his name, order the deaths of this and this person. And he named the people that he had killed. And like he said it with such pride that he was happy to do it. So like, as we say, he went down swinging. This is just the kind of personality we're talking about. But nonetheless, it doesn't take away that deep down inside, that poor neshama is in jail within the body and needs to be touched and fanned. And especially right before this person is going to be executed. So he was upset. But then he starts telling me about his life and his stories. Then all of a sudden, Hashem gave me the right words to say. I remembered his mother telling me about a pen pal that he had in New York who was a New Age Kabbalist that made these little amulets. So I'm not a big modern day Kabbalist and I don't make amulets, but I knew that there's a connection between Judaism, this situation, and this particular inmate who doesn't want to talk about Judaism. I said, your mother told me something about, don't you have a pen pal that he's into Kabbalah? And all of a sudden this inmate's eyes like open. Kabbalah? I love Kabbalah, he tells me. And I said, what is it that you love about Kabbalah? He says, I love the letters of the alphabet, the Hebrew alphabet, he tells me. So I said, what's your favorite letter? He said, my favorite letter is the Shimmel. So I said, the Shimmel? What's a Shimmel? He says, the Shimmel. And I remember he lifted up his hands with the cuffs and he put his 3 fingers up and he showed me the letter Shin. I said, oh, the Shin. He says, yeah, I'm sorry. I meant that Shin. I got confused about the dreidel, nun, gimel, hey, Shin. I call it the Shimmel. He says, yeah, the letter's the Shimmel. The Shin, I'm saying, he said. So I said, okay, so what do you like so much about the letter Shin? Why does it talk to you? We get so excited about it. He says, because I read somewhere that King David had a Shin on his shield. So I personally never heard it, but if it works for you, good for you, whatever. So he had a Shin, shkoyach. He says, and I see myself like King David because King David was a warrior and I'm a warrior. This is what the inmate tells me. So all of a sudden the next idea popped in my head. I said, so you're a warrior? I want to show you something. So I unzipped my tefillin and I took out the shel rosh, the head tefillin, and on the sides of the head tefillin is the letter Shin. So I said, look at this. And he got all excited and he said, that's the letter. So I said, Doug, you want to be a warrior? He says, yeah. I said, so let's put on tefillin. And he said, okay. So I was so excited. Finally, Hashem opened up the doors for me. I was able to put on the tefillin with him. And it was so meaningful to him that as crazy as he might have been, he put on the tefillin and in the midst of the Shema, he started crying with tears. And I was like, this is amazing. You see the ice block of the person, but you see the Pintele Yid, the little Jew, all of a sudden wake up and come alive and express itself with these tears. It was an unbelievable experience. And then we did Lidui, and we talked slightly about the execution and talked about what Judaism says about cremation. He said, honestly, Rabbi, I don't care. If you don't think I should be cremated, I'll tell my mother that she should talk to you about it. So I'm like, okay. So then I had to say goodbye to him. And so then the question is, how do you say goodbye to somebody that's about to be executed? Were you going to tell him like, hasta la vista, baby? Like, I don't know. I'm going to see him again. So I started thinking, in Judaism, we don't say goodbye. We say we'll meet again. I hope soon Mashiach should come and we'll all see each other very soon. And I want to just bless you. Chazak v'amatz, be strong. Hashem should help you. But before we leave and say goodbye, I wanted to know if you can do me a favor. I said, what, Rabbi? I said, can I give you a hug? He says, only if it makes you feel better. I said, it'll make me feel very, very good. So he said, okay, Rabbi. And he came over towards me and he leaned into me and I gave him a big bear hug. I wished him well and I left. And then I came back to Houston and a couple of days later was the day of his execution. His mother calls me on the phone, and I'm a little nervous because she was very upset that we were trying to convince him to not, because she said, look, that's what he wants. Why are you mixing in?
Not be cremated?
Yeah, that's what he wants. Why are you mixing in? And it's hard to explain because I'm a rabbi, and a rabbi is here as a guide to try to teach people what the Torah teaches, that this is Hashem's will, and this is not what should be done. She was more like, I'd rather do what my son wants, not what you guys want. And I understood where she was coming from, but obviously it was hard to massage the point. But anyhow, when she called me, I was scared that she's going to really rip into me because I did what she asked me not to do. And she says, Rabbi Goldstein? I'm like, yeah. And I'm shaking inside like, oh, here it comes. My son talked to me. I said, oh, he did. Oh, that's nice. She said, yes. And I must tell you something. My son was in prison for like 8 years, and he was on death row and totally mistreated, beat up, treated, just degraded all the time. And the only person who ever put loving hands on him was you. And I like started smiling. Yeah. Because my son told me that you gave him a hug. And he said, I know, because you put your loving hands on my son, that you really care about him. So therefore, we made a decision that after the execution, we're going to give you custody of the body. And so therefore, he could have a Jewish burial. And that's what ended up happening. So unfortunately, that evening he was executed. He was buried in Dallas. We arranged the Chav Gedish in Dallas to do the Tahara. He was given a proper Jewish burial and sent off to meet his creator in the Jewish way.
Amazing.
Amazing, Rabbi.
As podcasters, it's difficult to be speechless.
Yeah, I'm kind of speechless too.
Yeah, really. And I've heard the story before, but you gave it in such tremendous detail, which is really, really such a story. And it shows, we started with a joke, but it really is not a joke, because in the end, this mother did have some nachas that you were able to bring forward, some Jewish nachas. It's a testimony to your work, and it's a testimony to the leadership of the rabbi. Years ago, I knew about the prison work only through Rabbi Maris, because he was doing it in San Antonio throughout South Texas. And so I remember before we became very, very involved, I remember telling my wife, I go, what, there's not another organization that I'm aware of, another Jewish organization, that really puts its money where its mouth is and goes to see people that no one really is thinking or caring about. So literally these inmates, until Rabbi Traxler and yourself came along in Texas, were literally just forgotten Jews that were just left in a pile in the prisons. It really shows what love and outreach can accomplish. So really a great story, and such an amazing opportunity to share the love that the Rebbe wants us all to share. It's beautiful.
Rabbi Dovid Goldstein, Rabbi Red, is that your red hair has served you well. That sometimes not taking no for an answer is the right answer. And it sounds like you are the greatest advocate standing up for the prisoners, those who maybe don't have anyone else to advocate for them. You've really brought a great comfort to them and really given them the potential and the possibility to have a true rehabilitation the Jewish way. So thank you, Rabbi Goldstein, for everything you're doing and you continue to do.
I'd like to end off by thanking you, Matt, and you, Felix, for having this tremendous podcast to really put it out there, the importance of the gates of trust. And I'm telling you, it is such an important thing. It's been an important part of my shlichus. It's really like something that nourishes me and keeps me focused, because dealing with people, and especially with these dark things, it's easy to forget. And it's easy to just like think that maybe I control things. But when you keep on putting the text of gates of trust in front of you, it's like going to the spiritual chiropractor. It gives you an alignment, so to say. Keeps everything fresh and flowing. It's a big recharge for me. So I'm very grateful that you're getting it out there and helping people of all types to connect.
Thank you, Rabbi Goldstein, for all the tremendous work you're doing. I hope that we don't have to see you on the other side of the bars. Hopefully we can see you in your Chabad house.
Mitzvah Shem.
At the next Simcha.
Mitzvah Shem. And bottom line is, if you ever need anything, you know me. I'm just a phone call away. I'll make sure you get kosher food. Just joking.
You get one phone call. Call Rabbi Goldstein.
Well, call me.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi. What do you think, Felix?
Gosh, Matt, I mean, who knew? I mean, literally, like we started with the joke about a mother getting nachas, and then here he shows a story of just an absolute transformation. Someone who commits the worst sin, obviously multiple times. It sounds like he wasn't even in jail very long, that they were able to put through the punishment fairly quickly. It was his destiny to meet this guy, obviously. It was always going to happen. It really just shows you there's no place where we are able to really lose hope altogether. There's no such thing as lost hope. And I also think really such a great message in his Pesach Sheni. The idea of second chances overall, the idea of what happened also really proved the point that the Jewish inmates were wronged. And even the authorities can pay a price and will have to make amends. I'm sure it gave those Jewish prisoners hope that he was able to rally for them. We don't know of anyone that advocated for the prisoners in Texas, at least. And I'm going to assume that in other states it works very similarly with the shluchim that are involved. The Aleph organization is international, and it really does amazing things. So such a great story and such great work.
Rabbi Goldstein is really a hero in what he's doing. The thing that's phenomenal to me is that he didn't even aim to go into this direction. It's like Hashem took him and placed him in this place, and he's been able to bring so much good to the prisoners and to the whole system. And I'm sure it's having ripple effects around the country and potentially around the world. So I have to say, kol hakavod to Rabbi Goldstein. Not that I'd like to be one of his prisoners one day.
No.
But I think he's really one of the people who are really doing good things in this world. So I think we're all very humbled by his example.
Yeah. It's good training for any shliach, because if you can handle the prison crowd, you can handle any Shabbos crowd.
Didn't you have a joke? Why is it the Jews never last long in prison?
Yeah, we all know the answer to that, because we always eat the lox.
Good one, Felix.
Thank you for listening to the Gate of Trust podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe, leave a rating, and share the podcast with the people you love. To access today's show notes, ask Matt and Felix a question, or suggest a Gate of Trust story to be featured on the show, visit gateoftrust.org/podcast.
You think you got it under control, you're on a roll, living it up, living your dreams. But when it all goes bust at the seams, then you scream and cry to the one on high. He's been it from the beginning when you felt like you were winning. He was calling all the shots, he gave you all that you got. So when you low